Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. At a certain point in the defense speech which Socrates is giving, and he's on trial for his life, recorded in Plato's Apology, Socrates actually takes on one of his younger accusers, a young man of Athens from a noble family named Meletus. And the charges that have been brought against Socrates, the official charges, are of corrupting the young men of Athens, and impiety. And I'm going to look at impiety in another core concept video. This one is focusing on Socrates' responses and the arguments that he's making in response to this young man Meletus. He's leading him through some back and forth dialogue, what we would call cross-examination almost. And he brings up a number of interesting points. And first, he actually accuses Meletus of not really being that interested in or that occupied with, or let alone competent in, talking about these topics of corrupting the young. He says, Meletus, you never actually gave any thought to this, so you're not really a competent observer. And he's talking to the people of the jury as well when he's doing that. I have three arguments here, three main arguments that Socrates makes. Each argument should culminate in the idea, I don't actually deserve to be charged with this. I'm innocent of this charge. So the first argument, he asks Meletus, and there's this actual dialogue here, some back and forth. He says, so let me ask you, you're saying that I corrupt the young people, the young men. There's an opposite to corruption, which is improving. Who improves the young people? And Meletus first gives a sort of stock answer that was common among Greek city-states at the time: the laws, the institutions. It's the city itself which does that. And so Socrates says, well, I'm not asking you about laws, I'm asking you who can you point to that actually improves the young people? And Meletus says, well, all of your fellow citizens, and the people on the jury. Remember, juries at that time were not what we're accustomed to, 12 people in a courtroom, but rather it was the right of Athenians to participate in judicial deliberations. So this is a large assembly. And so he's saying, essentially, all the people of Athens that have a certain amount of property, all the people that can participate in the politics, the commerce, the culture of Athens, any one of them improves the young people. How do they do that? Through traditional education, through modeling, through interaction. And so Socrates now has him, because he's going to say, so let me get this straight, Meletus. Everybody else improves the young. All the other citizens of Athens, he's putting aside people who are resident aliens, sophists, people like that. All of them improve the people of Athens, including the poets, including the playwrights, including the craftspeople, including all the politicians. But I'm the guy who corrupts them. And Meletus says, yeah, that's it exactly. So then Socrates says, well, that's a little strange, because in pretty much every other field that we can look at, there's somebody who actually knows what they're doing, and they tend to be the people that actually improve whatever it is that they're working on. And then there's the rest of us, rum-dums, and we're liable to screw things up. So, if you think about, for example, medicine, do you just go to anybody and say, look, I think I might have appendicitis, but I'm not quite sure. It really hurts a lot. I've looked at WebMD. What do you think? What should I do? No, you actually go to the doctor, or you go to the emergency room. You go to some sort of expert, because Joe Blow off the street is liable to give you advice that'll get you killed, or damage your body even further. What about finances? Do we do this? Do we just go up to anybody on the street and say, I just got an inheritance, or I just won the lottery. I need to think about how to invest my money. What are your opinions on that? We don't even do this with politics, which is a bit more of a area where we think that competence tends to be widespread. We don't go to just anybody. We tend to go to people that we think have some sort of basic understanding of that. So Socrates is saying, he actually uses the example of horses here. Would you take but we could think about it in terms of vets. If you have a dog or cat, would you just take your sick dog or cat to Uncle Ralph or, Jim down the street? Or just walk around with, your cat, maybe in a knapsack, and go up to people and say, feel kitty cat's head here. How's he doing? What do I need to do? Different food? Maybe make him run more? Leave him alone? I don't really know. Does he need more sleep? Does he need less sleep? No, you actually go to a vet, because the vet can actually improve the condition of the animal. So if we think about human beings that way, and we think about moral qualities as a matter of improvement or corruption, you'd think that you couldn't just go to anybody and get, some improvement. As a matter of fact, it's probably the other way around. Now, Socrates is not saying that he's the one guy who actually does know. As a matter of fact, throughout this dialogue, he's saying, look, there's a lot of things I don't know, but I'm at least cognizant of my own ignorance, as opposed to these other schleps over here who think that they know it all and are likely to screw things up. So that's the basic argument that's being made. He's saying, Meletus, this is not a likely case that I'm the only person who's corrupting the young. By way of analogy to every other field of human endeavor and interest, it looks like it's more often that the many aren't making things better. Now, that's not a decisive knockout blow. This one's a little bit stronger. He asked Meletus, you say that I corrupt the young people, right? And Meletus says, yeah, you're doing it all the time. So then Socrates says, do I corrupt them knowingly? Do I know that I'm actually making them worse? And Meletus says, yes, that's part of why we need to execute you. We need to get you off the scene, because you know what you're doing. And then Socrates says, do I do it willingly? Now, the Greeks didn't have exactly the same conception of the will that we do later on. The word there is more along the lines of, voluntarily, or is it coming from me, or is it coming from something else? Aristotle later on will say compulsion or ignorance could excuse a person, remove their culpability. Socrates is asking him, am I choosing to damage these young people? And Meletus says, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. So once again, Socrates has gotten him to make an admission that's going to lead down the rabbit hole of argumentation. And Socrates says, well, when we damage people, are we making them worse or better? And here there's a little bit of a play on words, a little bit of equivocation going on, but I think that you can see past that. If I have my neighbor and I make my neighbor worse off morally, I corrupt them. For example, this isn't an example that Socrates uses, but you could think about this. Let's say I'm a swinger and I want to sleep with my neighbor's wife, and I'm married myself, and let's say I'm an inconsistent swinger. I want to sleep with other people's wives, but I don't want other people to sleep with my wife. And so I corrupt my neighbor and I say, we ought to share wives, meaning that you ought to share your wife with me, and I get his wife on board with that. And I've made them morally worse, at least by certain standards, right? And now I start doing that sort of behavior, and then the neighbor says, yeah, that sounds great. Now I'm going to sleep with your wife. And I'm, oh, buddy, I'm not going for that. The neighbor can say, well, you're a hypocrite, you're inconsistent. But the neighbor can also say, look, you're the one who actually told me that this is okay for me to do. I've corrupted my neighbor. We could think about this with stealing. We could think about this with lying. We could think about this with anything that people generally frown upon. Littering, If I'm telling my child, go ahead and litter all you want, it'd be kind of silly for me to complain about the fact that the living room's a mess, that there's candy wrappers and Coke cans everywhere, right? That's what Socrates is getting at. He's saying, don't you realize that if I were willingly and knowingly making people bad, and not just people across the ocean in Egypt or down there in Sparta, but people in my own hometown, if I was making the young people, the people that are going to be around for a long time, the people who have lots of energy, if I'm making them bad, I'm setting a trap for myself. I'm actually making conditions worse for myself, and that's totally irrational. How would somebody knowingly or willingly do something which is going to be destructive to their own interests like that? And then here he actually says to Meletus, look, either you can have that I am knowingly doing it, in which case your argument falls apart completely because of what I've said, or you can say that I don't really know what I'm doing, in which case you shouldn't be taking me to trial. You should actually be teaching me. You should be improving me yourself instead of making me worse off by trying to put me on trial and potentially kill me. That is a pretty good argument. There are some flaws that you could point out with it, but it is a pretty good argument. The third argument that he makes is a little bit later on. He's quit cross-examining Meletus, and now he's reminding the people of the jury, and he says, look out there at your neighbors. Some of you were young men who hung out with me, and presumably, if Meletus is right, I was doing the same thing back then as I am now to the young people, talking with them, helping them to live a self-examined life, teaching them how to cross-examine people, sort of by example. I must have damaged them then. I must have damaged that guy and that guy. And he picks people out by name. He says, he even mentions Plato in this one, which is kind of interesting. Then he says, these are all adults now. So presumably, if I damaged them, if I hurt them, if I made them worse off, why aren't they complaining? Why aren't they bringing a lawsuit against me saying, that guy Socrates, he told me that this was the way to live, and I did live that way, and man, it just messed up my life, or he messed up my relationships, or he messed up my wealth, or he messed up my body. None of them are saying anything like that. None of these adults who've actually, presumably, benefited from being in contact with Socrates turned out to have been corrupted. And he says, well, maybe I screwed them up so much that they don't even realize that they're screwed up. But what about their friends and relatives? They're out there in the audience too. If I screwed up, and he doesn't actually, talk about Plato this way, but if I screwed up that guy Plato, why didn't Plato's dad say, hey, you need to quit hanging around with this Socrates guy because he's messing you up? Why didn't Plato's brother say that? Why didn't Plato's friends? Why is it just now, Meletus, that somebody is coming on the scene after I've been doing this for, decades, saying, yeah, you're messing up the young people now? That's a pretty good argument as well. In part because Socrates' conduct, as he's making clear, has been consistent over decades. So if he is corrupting the young right now, presumably he's been corrupting the young for several decades, for several generations. And there should be some empirical evidence of this. And Meletus can't provide that. You put all three of these arguments together, and this is a pretty strong defense against the charges that he's corrupting the young.